Hey everyone, and welcome to lesson 3.9. Today we will be factoring complex trinomials. So we've seen simple trinomials in the past, and simple trinomial is in the form given here, but the coefficient on the x squared term was 1. In a complex trinomial, the coefficient on the x squared term is not 1. It's something other than 1. And now I know that we've seen some simple trinomials where we could common factor that value out, but in a complex trinomial you can't. So, or even if you did common factor, you would still be left with some value in front of the x squared. So today's lesson we are going to focus on one of the many methods that you can use to factor these complex trinomials. Today we're going to look at decomposition. And probably in class is when we are going to maybe take a look at some other methods to factor these complex trinomials. So when you are working with these complex trinomials, it's kind of like a combination of the product sum method that we have been doing, and then it turns into a factor by grouping question. So the product sum is very similar, except this time we are looking at the first value and the last value, and we're going to multiply those two things together. Once we do that, that is the product that we're looking for, but we're still trying to find a value that adds to the middle term. So once we get to the questions, you'll kind of see that put into action. So as I kind of mentioned before, we are going to turn this into kind of a factor by grouping question. And the way that we do that is by breaking up the middle term. And then we group and common factor. So let's try an example. So as I mentioned before, you always want to see if you can common factor first. So looking at this, I see that we have a 2, a 13, and a 15. There is no common factor here. So what we are dealing with is a complex trinomial. So we want to find product and sum. To find the product, we are going to look at the 2 and the 15. If we multiply those two things together, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to positive 30 and then still add to the middle term of 13. Once you decide that those two numbers should be 10 and 3, we don't put them into the brackets like we normally would when we had simple trinomial. Because we've decided to use decomposition, what we're going to do is actually rewrite this expression, except we're not going to write 13x, we're going to break it down into 10x plus 3x. And it doesn't matter which order you write it, 10x first or 3x first, it doesn't matter. So we haven't actually changed anything, we just rewrote the expression. Instead of writing 13x, we wrote 10x plus 3x, because if you added them together, you'd get 13x. And so like I mentioned before, we are changing this into a factor by grouping question because now we have 4 terms. So if you take a look at the first group and then take a look at the second group, each one of those groups has something in common. So in the first group, a 2 and an x is common. So I would be left with an x plus 5. And if I look at the second group, a positive 3 is common. And we're left with x plus 5. And as we mentioned in class, super important, the brackets must be identical. If they are not the same, there is a mistake somewhere. Go back, look at your work, and find that mistake. Because you can't go on to the second step or the last step until these brackets are the same. And now, like we've done before with factor by grouping, we have two terms. Both of those terms have an x plus 5, which is common. And then what we're left with is the 2x, and then the plus 3. Okay, so now we are fully factored. Let's try one more together. For this first one, again, we check to see if you can common factor first. So I'm looking, nothing is factorable. So I'm just going to kind of go ahead with our decomposition method. Take a look at the first and the last number. They multiply to negative 18. So our job is to find two numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to negative 7. Take a minute, think of those numbers. You should end up with -9 and +2. And when you are ready, they do not go automatically in those brackets like we've done in the past. We break up the middle term and rewrite the expression as 18x squared minus 9x plus 2x, because that gives us -7x, and then minus 1. And now we can factor by grouping. In our first group, I see that a 9x is common. I'll divide this by 9x, which gives me 2x, and I'll divide this by 9x, which gives me -1. Now notice there's nothing common here, so but it is identical to the bracket that we want to end up with. So if I take out a +1, if I factor out a +1, that changes nothing in this bracket. So now that we have brackets identical, I can write the 2x minus 1 because that's the common bracket. That leaves us with 9x, and then don't forget the +1 afterwards. Okay, for question C, I would like for you to try it. So pause the video, give it a shot on your own, and see if you end up with the exact same answer as me. So just to kind of review, we found the two numbers that we needed were the -6 and the -1, and we broke down, and although there were two variables, we just kind of kept it as is. We wanted to keep like terms, so -6xy and the -1xy. And then notice that when we did the factor by grouping, in the second group, I factored out a -y, and that ensured that the bracket would match this first bracket here. So we have a +x and a -2y. So hopefully you ended up with the exact same answer, and if you have any questions about that, make sure you put a little star beside that one, and we'll definitely talk about it in class. For this last one, remember we always try to common factor first. Notice that we have a common factor of 2 and a common factor of x. So we're going to take that out first. That leaves us with 3x squared minus 10x plus 8. And although we common factored, what remains inside the bracket is still a complex trinomial because we still have that value in front of the x squared term. So for our product and our sum, we are going to look at the 3 and the 8, multiply those two together to give us a product of 24. And then we are still looking for a sum of -10. So two numbers that multiply to 24, add to -10 should be -6 and -4. So now that you've factored out this 2x, you just kind of ignore it, and well, you don't ignore it, but you keep writing it. It kind of goes along for the ride, but we're just focusing on this. We are going to rewrite the expression by breaking down the 10 into -6x and -4x. Okay, so nothing has changed. We just rewrote the expression, and then because we've done that, we can do some factor by grouping. I'll look at the first group and then the next one. In the first group, I'm going to factor out a 3 and an x. That leaves me with x minus 2. In the second group, watch your sign. I'm going to factor out a -4, and that leaves me with x and then minus 2. And then to finish up, the common bracket was x minus 2, and what's left over is the 3x and the -4. Just as a side note, notice that even when you do have a simple trinomial, you can still use decomposition. Although it takes a few extra steps, it still works. So very quickly, if you were looking at this for decomposition, you would take the 1 and the -14, and the product you'd be looking for is still just negative 14. The sum would be negative 5, and if you're looking for those two numbers, you would say negative 7 and 2 should do the trick. So if you were trying to factor this using decomposition, you would break down the negative 5 into negative 7 and 2. And then when you did factor by grouping, there's an x common here and a positive 2 common there. Which gives us x minus 7 and x plus 2. Now, usually we would just jump to the final answer here. Because it's a simple trinomial, these are extra steps that you don't necessarily need. But if you do prefer the method of decomposition, that's definitely one other way to do it. So as I mentioned before, there are a few other ways to do some factoring, and that's definitely something we'll be talking about in class. But for now, that is the end of the lesson. If you have any questions, please make sure that you write them down and ask them in class. Other than that, have a great night. Take care, guys.